the whole point of the Doomsday machine is lost. If you keep it a secret.
In the long tense years of the Cold War, nations across the globe built up their arsenals, testing nuclear weapons and spending plenty of time worrying about what the other side was planning against them. The United States and the Soviet Union both engaged in plenty of propaganda and espionage, but nothing loomed harder than the threat of nuclear weapons. The whole world had witnessed the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 and their tragic aftermath, and nobody wanted to be next.
You are in the crosshairs of the bomb sight. An enemy is centering on you. You are a citizen of the free world.
At the same time, that meant that no government wanted to be caught without a means to defend themselves from such a strike. Some Soviet developers began to investigate the possibility of automated or semi-automated systems that would ensure that attacks could still move forward, even if a devastating first blow had been dealt by the US. Thus was born the perimeter system, more ominously known as Dead Hand. Now, Dead Hand is widely known as a doomsday machine, but many of its capabilities, including its current state of operations, remain shrouded in mystery. The concept of a reactionary, semi-automated nuclear launch system goes back to the Cold War. Nuclear weapons, even more powerful than the ones used at the close of World War II, were in development, threatening to wipe out major population centers. Naturally, everyone was absolutely terrified on both sides. Yes, even the Soviets were scared. General Varfolomy Korobushin, who was the USSR's former Deputy Chief of Staff of Strategic Rocket Forces, told an interviewer in 1992, "We were very afraid of the Americans." That fear led to the development of all sorts of weapons systems, including Dead Hand. Sources indicate that it was first ordered in 1974, although it didn't go online until 1985. By then, US President Ronald Reagan had been doing a fair amount of saber rattling, although Reagan would have argued that he was only shoring up US defenses and not its offensive capabilities. Still, Reagan's questionable talk of things like a Star Wars orbital missile system didn't do much to allay Soviet fears in an increasingly tense technological environment.
I'd like to think that this could be the beginning of a modern crusade for peace.
That wasn't how it felt in the USSR. To those in the know, Dead Hand may have seemed like an increasingly necessary step. Now, you've probably heard of a fail-safe, in which the breakdown of a system or piece of machinery automatically reverts it to a relatively safe state. Dead Hand used the much more ominous fail-deadly concept. As the name implies, a breakdown in such a system would still allow for deadly retaliation. In the case of Dead Hand, its activation meant that any lapse in that communication, along with other factors like detected nuclear strikes, would transfer control of the nation's nuclear launch system to that bunker's personnel. Those people could choose not to launch the missiles, but the intent would be to allow for deadly retaliation even if part of the Soviet system failed after an enemy strike. So just a bunch of guys in a bunker deciding the fate of the world. What could go wrong? More on that in a sec. The failed deadly scenario is effectively a component of mutually assured destruction. This infamous facet of Cold War strategy is a kind of deterrence in which both sides have the capability to completely obliterate the other. I think you know this, but just so we're clear, if one power were to attack, the other could potentially launch a just as deadly counterattack that would leave both sides in irradiated cinders. The Dead Hand twist on this scenario is that the USSR would have been able to engage in mutually assured destruction even if the US had been able to hit first. The whole concept of Dead Hand is obviously terrifying on an existential level, but there's a silver lining built into the system's design. It could theoretically give decision-making officials the space to actually think about their actions. In a time of looming crisis, they could turn on Dead Hand but not immediately launch anything, buying more time for top-level discussion and keeping the Soviet government from jumping the gun in horrifying fashion. Those sorts of mistakes can happen, as in the 1983 incident in which a Soviet early warning system claimed to detect evidence of incoming nuclear missiles. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on watch duty when the warning came in, but intentionally failed to alert higher-ups to narrowly avoid the end of the world. His informed guess that it was a false alarm paid off. The system had misidentified the sun's reflection off clouds as missile exhaust. Petrov would later explain to reporters that the whole thing was kept quiet because such a system failure was considered shameful. Turns out the human element was a good thing. Though Dead Hand was in development at this time and not active, it's easy to understand why its system was considered an improvement. A possible mistake, such as the 1983 false alarm, would be able to pass so long as no signs of nuclear explosions were detected. Now, one of the key components of the Dead Hand system is its ability to detect the signs of a nuclear strike before following through on the rest of its programming. That would be cold comfort to anyone living in a potentially vulnerable area like Moscow, but it would at least potentially avert a global conflict that could take many, many more lives.
You cannot win a nuclear war!
After being turned on by command during what had been deemed a crisis period, the system would then await for signs of attack. But what actually were the signs? In his 1992 interview, Vartholomew Korobushin identified them as, quote, a combination of light, radioactivity, and overpressure. If these were all detected together and at presumably high enough levels, the system would assume some sort of strike had happened. Such signs of a nuclear detonation are hardly going to be promising, but Dead Hand was meant to then wait for some amount of time for contact from command in Moscow. Too long without hearing from them, and the system would assume that the signs of a nuclear attack it had just sensed were the real deal. A quick scan of the Dead Hand system may lead you to believe that it's largely free from human influence, like the deadly computer with its digital hand on the very real Switch in war games.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play.
As far as Dead Hand is concerned, there's a human element involved that may make you feel a little more at ease. Yes, like in war games, quite a lot of the system seems to be automated, with computers detecting the signs of a nuclear strike, communicating with officials, and transferring power. But there are at least two known points where living, breathing humans must ferry that process along. At the very beginning, someone has to activate the system, as sources indicate that Dead Hand is normally left in the off position. At that point, it automatically runs through four major if-then propositions. If those signs of an attack are detected, then it checks communication links with command. If communications are clear and no further signs are detected, then Dead Hand assumes that someone's still alive to make the relevant launch decisions and stands down. If nuclear weapons really have gone off and Moscow or some other predetermined center of power has gone eerily silent, then Dead Hand automatically transfers command to humans somewhere else. The final decision to launch is then in the hands of either a group of people or, perhaps in an especially dire situation, just one individual. While the Soviet Union and now Russia have been pretty tight-lipped about the exact parameters of Dead Hand, we have the general idea that it can transfer control of nuclear armament to staff in a bunker. But where is that bunker exactly? Even the most talkative people who have disclosed their insider information to journalists and other observers haven't said. Still, there are hints. Given the scenario in which such a bunker would become very, very important, it's all but certain that this location is very heavily shielded. A 1993 report by the New York Times wondered if it was somewhere south of Moscow, but US intelligence instead concentrated on mountains in the Ural Range to the east of the Russian capital. Both the Yamanta and Kosvinsky peaks hosted mysterious large-scale construction projects in the 1970s, when increased US weapons capability allegedly pushed the Soviets into action. Reportedly, satellite imagery showed work continuing on both sites into the late 90s, well after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Kosvinsky facility may be the most obvious candidate, as it's said to have the ability to communicate over far distances with very low-frequency radio. Bruce G. Blair, a former US military officer with launch control experience, told Slate that, based on his contacts with Soviet officers, he believes the facility is the critical link to Russia's Dead Hand communications network. While much of the information outsiders have about the Dead Hand system comes from the Soviet era, the USSR had collapsed by the end of 1991. Still, it stands to reason that Dead Hand lives on in some form or another. When he hasn't been busy trying to hide other secrets, Russian President Vladimir Putin repeatedly reminded world leaders of his nation's nuclear capability. He's officially taken on the strategy of de-escalation, in which a major attack could be met with a limited use of nuclear weapons and an attempt to get everything back to its previous geopolitical state. That said, no one's been able to get any definitive word out of officials regarding Dead Hand's current status. In August 2025, after President Donald Trump spoke of the dead economies of India and Russia, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev responded in a chilling but mildly confusing fashion. He stated on social media app Telegram, "As for the talk about the dead economies of India and Russia and entering dangerous territory, maybe he should recall his favorite movies about the Walking Dead, and also remember how dangerous the so-called Dead Hand, which doesn't even exist, could be." On the surface, that statement makes it sound like Dead Hand is no more, but it didn't exactly reassure anyone. Certainly not Trump, who responded by ordering 2 nuclear submarines to move closer to Russian territory.
A threat was made by a former president of Russia, and we're going to protect our people.
While hardly anyone expects Vladimir Putin just to stroll out of the Kremlin and give the nearest bystander Dead Hand blueprints, it seems a bit odd that there's been quite so much secrecy about the system. Though it was ordered in the 1970s and put online in the mid-80s, it wasn't officially acknowledged until 1999. Even then, despite consistent writing about dead hands since the early 90s, it's never quite made it into the larger public consciousness. Even former CIA James Woolsey was shocked at the prospect, remarking to an interviewer in 2009, "I hope to God the Soviets were more sensible than that." It is perhaps even odder when considering the concept of nuclear deterrence. The whole thing relies on one's enemy knowing what you're capable of. While the Soviet Union obviously wouldn't want to give away every detail, a bit more publicity could have helped tamp down American aggression and nuclear fears. At least that's what Oppenheimer believed.
It is grave danger for us that these decisions are taken on the basis of facts held secret.
Perhaps it was deemed too much of a risk, whether in terms of security concerns or worries about inflaming an already tense relationship between two heavily armed superpowers. Okay, now, if you thought that the Soviet Union was the only country crazy enough to consider a failed deadly system, that'd be a big old nope. Other nations have considered failed deadly scenarios too, like the UK's post-war take on the concept in its C3I system. C3I stands for Command, Control, Communications, and Information, all vital if you're thinking about plunging the world into nuclear war. In the case of Britain, C3I was designed to fail deadly in case of a Soviet strike, but its smaller military resources made some worry that the system might not work and could lead to further escalation. Ultimately, the British worked in cooperation with American forces under the NATO umbrella, coordinating nuclear strategies while still allowing room for the UK to retaliate if push came to irradiated shove.
Gee, I wish we had one of them Doomsday machines, Tainty.
Some folks out there have argued that President Eisenhower's orders to ramp up US nuclear armament and engage in nuclear deterrence meant that his government was engaging in some form of failed deadly preparation. But the US also took on projects more similar to Dead Hand, including the implementation of sensors that could detect nuclear detonations and the emergency rocket communications system. That said, the US relied on service members in Strategic Air Command Airborne Command Post to give a theoretical launch order. This project, called Looking Glass, was in the air from 1961 until 1990 and existed more out in the open in the spirit of nuclear deterrence.